The grand ballroom of Ashworth House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their golden glow reflecting off crystal chandeliers and illuminating the cream of London society as they swirled across the polished marble floor in an elaborate waltz. It was the height of the 1817 social season, and Lady Ashworth's annual ball was considered the most prestigious event of the spring calendar, an occasion where fortunes were made, reputations established, and the intricate web of aristocratic alliances was rewoven for another year. Duke Adrian Kingsley stood at the edge of the ballroom, his imposing figure cutting a striking silhouette against the ornate backdrop of gilt mirrors and silk-draped walls. At 34, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made conversations pause when he entered a room and caused ambitious mothers to push their daughters forward in hopes of catching his attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark auburn hair that caught glints of copper in the candlelight, and penetrating green eyes that seemed to see through the elaborate facades of polite society, Adrian carried himself with the natural authority of a man born to rule over vast estates and influence the fate of nations. Yet for all his wealth, title, and undeniable magnetism, the Duke of Kingsley remained stubbornly, deliberately unmarried. At an age when most men of his station had long since secured the succession with a suitable bride and a nursery full of heirs, Adrian continued to resist the increasingly desperate attempts of society matrons to entangle him in their matrimonial schemes. He had his reasons that went far deeper than mere reluctance to surrender his bachelor freedom. Adrian had learned early that in the rarefied world of the ton, everything had a price. Love, loyalty, even human dignity could be bought and sold as easily as shares in the exchange. His own parents' marriage had been a perfect example, a cold arrangement between two great families that had produced the required heir, but little else in the way of warmth or affection. He had sworn long ago that he would never subject himself or any woman to such a sterile union, preferring solitude to the kind of calculated partnership that passed for marriage among his peers. Tonight, however, something was different. As Adrian surveyed the familiar tableau of London society at play, his attention was caught by an unusual commotion near the far end of the ballroom. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be some sort of private auction, though the participants were trying to maintain an air of casual conversation that fooled no one who knew how to read the subtle signs of serious negotiation. Curious despite himself, Adrian moved closer, using his considerable height and the natural deference his title commanded to position himself where he could observe the proceedings without appearing to do so. What he saw made his blood run cold with a fury he hadn't experienced since his youth. At the center of the group stood Sir Reginald Blackwood, a man whose reputation for financial desperation was matched only by his complete lack of moral scruples. Beside him, looking pale and resigned in a way that spoke of long suffering, stood a young woman who could not have been more than 22 or 23. She was beautiful in a delicate, ethereal way that seemed almost out of place in the glittering excess of the ballroom, honey-colored hair arranged in an elaborate style that couldn't quite disguise its natural tendency to curl, and eyes the color of violets that held a depth of sadness that made Adrian's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. But it wasn't her beauty that captured Adrian's attention so completely. It was the way she stood there, silent and still, while the men around her discussed her future as if she were a piece of property to be evaluated and purchased. Her dress, though of good quality, was clearly not new, and there was something in her posture, a careful stillness that spoke of someone who had learned to make herself invisible, that suggested she was not here by choice. "The girl is well bred, I can vouch for that," Sir Reginald was saying to a portly gentleman Adrian recognized as Lord Pemberton, a man whose taste for young women was as well known as it was unsavory. Excellent bloodlines, properly educated, and completely malleable. She understands her position and won't cause any difficulties. "And her dowry?" inquired another man, Mr. Hartwell, whose own financial troubles were common knowledge among the ton. "Modest but sufficient," Sir Reginald replied smoothly, "though I think we can all agree that her other attributes more than compensate for any deficiency in that area." Adrian felt his hands clench into fists as he realized what he was witnessing. This wasn't a casual conversation about a potential marriage arrangement. This was a human auction, thinly disguised as polite society negotiation. The young woman was being sold to the highest bidder, and from the calculating looks being exchanged among the men, it was clear that her welfare was the last thing on anyone's mind. "She's had proper training, I assume?" Lord Pemberton asked with a leer that made Adrian's skin crawl. Knows how to please a man of discerning tastes? The young woman's face went even paler at this crude inquiry, but she remained silent, her violet eyes fixed on some point beyond the group of men, as if she were trying to remove herself mentally from the degrading proceedings. "Of course," Sir Reginald assured him. "She's been thoroughly prepared for her duties as a wife. Very accommodating, if you understand my meaning." That was enough. Adrian had heard all he could stomach of this disgusting charade. Without conscious thought, he stepped forward into the circle, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the kind of icy authority that made grown men step back involuntarily, "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion." Sir Reginald's face lit up with the kind of obsequious delight that marked all his interactions with those who outranked him socially. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. We were just discussing Miss Hart's future prospects." "Miss Hart," Adrian repeated, his green eyes fixing on the young woman's face for the first time. She looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope, though it was quickly suppressed, as if she had learned not to expect rescue from any quarter. "Yes, my ward," Sir Reginald continued, clearly sensing an opportunity to involve an even wealthier potential buyer in his sordid auction. "A lovely girl, as you can see, very well behaved, excellent breeding." "Your ward," Adrian said softly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made several of the men shift uncomfortably. "And you're discussing her future as if she were livestock at market." Sir Reginald's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on with the desperate determination of a man who saw his financial salvation within reach. "Well, Your Grace, you understand how these things work. A young woman of good family but limited means must be settled advantageously. I'm simply ensuring that Vivienne finds a suitable protector." "Protector?" Adrian repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "Is that what you call it?" The tension in the group was becoming palpable, and several of the other men began to edge away, sensing that the conversation was taking a dangerous turn. But Lord Pemberton, emboldened by drink and greed, stepped forward with a proprietary air. "Now see here, Kingsley," he blustered. "We were here first. If you're interested in the girl, you'll have to wait your turn or make a better offer." Adrian's eyes went cold as winter ice as he turned his full attention to Lord Pemberton. "An offer," he said quietly. "You speak as if Miss Hart were a commodity to be purchased." "Well, isn't she?" Pemberton laughed crudely. "Come now, we're all men of the world here. The girl needs a husband, and we're willing to provide one. What's wrong with a little friendly competition?" Adrian looked around the circle of faces, seeing the greed, the lust, the complete absence of any consideration for the young woman at the center of their negotiations. Then he looked at Miss Hart herself, noting the way her hands trembled slightly, despite her outward composure, the barely controlled desperation in her violet eyes, the resigned acceptance of a fate she clearly found abhorrent. Something inside him snapped. "What is the price?" he asked, his voice cutting through the sudden silence like a blade. Sir Reginald's eyes lit up with avarice. "Your Grace, you heard me," Adrian said, his tone deadly calm. "What is the price for Miss Hart? Since you're also determined to treat her like merchandise, let's dispense with the pretense. Name your price." The young woman, Vivienne, looked at him with shock and something that might have been betrayal, as if she had hoped for a moment that he might be different from the others. Sir Reginald, however, was practically rubbing his hands together with glee. "Well, Your Grace, for a man of your standing, shall we say £10,000? Adrian didn't even blink at the astronomical sum. "Done." The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled group. Lord Pemberton's face turned purple with rage, while the other men stared in disbelief at the casual way Adrian had just outbid them all. "Excellent," Sir Reginald exclaimed, barely able to contain his excitement. "I'll have my solicitor draw up the papers immediately. The marriage can be arranged for—" "Marriage?" Adrian interrupted, his voice sharp. "Who said anything about marriage?" Sir Reginald's face fell. "But Your Grace, surely you don't mean to suggest, that is, Miss Hart is a respectable young woman." "Exactly," Adrian said, his green eyes blazing with controlled fury. "She is a respectable young woman, not a piece of property to be bought and sold. And since you seem to have forgotten that fact, allow me to remind you." Without warning, Adrian reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather purse heavy with gold. He tossed it at Sir Reginald's feet with such force that several coins spilled out, glinting in the candlelight. "There's your £10,000, he said, his voice carrying clearly enough that several nearby conversations stopped as people turned to stare. "Consider it payment in full for your ward's freedom. Miss Hart is no longer under your guardianship, no longer subject to your schemes, and no longer available for purchase by any of you gentlemen." The silence that followed was deafening. Sir Reginald stared at the purse at his feet as if it were a snake, while the other men looked between Adrian and the money, with expressions of confusion and growing alarm. "Your Grace," Sir Reginald said carefully, "I'm not sure I understand. If you're not planning to marry the girl, then what exactly are you purchasing?" Adrian's smile was cold and sharp as a blade. "Her freedom, you fool! I'm purchasing her freedom from all of you." He turned to Vivienne, who was staring at him with wide violet eyes that held a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and lingering fear. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice gentling considerably as he addressed her directly for the first time, "you are no longer obligated to remain in Sir Reginald's custody. You are free to go wherever you choose, to make your own decisions about your future. No one here has any claim on you." Vivienne's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. She looked around the circle of men who had been discussing her fate moments before, then back at Adrian, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "This is preposterous." Lord Pemberton exploded, his face red with indignation. You can't just buy someone's freedom. It doesn't work that way, doesn't it?" Adrian asked mildly. "You were all perfectly willing to buy her subjugation. Why should purchasing her liberation be any different?" Because, Pemberton spluttered, unable to articulate exactly why one transaction was acceptable, while the other was not. "Because it exposes the ugly truth of what you were really doing here tonight," Adrian finished for him. "You were trafficking in human misery, gentlemen. You were treating a young woman like a commodity, to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. And now that someone has actually done exactly that, purchased her, you're uncomfortable with the implications." The confrontation was beginning to attract attention from the broader ballroom. Conversations were stopping as people turned to stare at the unusual scene playing out near the windows. Lady Ashworth herself was making her way through the crowd, her face a mask of polite concern that didn't quite hide her alarm at having such a scene unfold at her carefully orchestrated social event. "Your Grace," she said as she approached, "is everything quite all right? Our guests seem concerned." Adrian turned to face his hostess, and Vivienne noticed that his expression softened slightly when he addressed the older woman. "Lady Ashworth, I apologize for any disruption to your lovely evening. I was simply concluding a business transaction with Sir Reginald." "A business transaction?" Lady Ashworth's eyebrows rose as she took in the scattered coins at Sir Reginald's feet and the tense faces of the men surrounding them. "How unusual." "Indeed," Adrian agreed. "Sir Reginald was offering his ward for sale to the highest bidder. I simply made a successful bid." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Lady Ashworth's face went pale as she realized the implications of what Adrian was suggesting. "Surely you don't mean to imply—" "I mean to imply nothing," Adrian said firmly. "I am stating quite clearly that Sir Reginald was auctioning off Miss Hart to these gentlemen, and I have purchased her freedom from all of them." Lady Ashworth looked around the circle of men, noting their guilty expressions and uncomfortable postures. Her reputation as a hostess depended on maintaining the highest standards of propriety at her events, and the suggestion that human trafficking had been taking place in her ballroom was potentially devastating. "Sir Reginald," she said, her voice carrying the kind of icy authority that only a woman of her social standing could command, "is this true?" Sir Reginald's face had gone from pale to red, and back to pale again as he realized the precarious position he was in. "Lady Ashworth, I assure you, there has been a misunderstanding. I was simply discussing suitable marriage arrangements for my ward." "By asking for bids," Adrian interjected smoothly. "By describing her as malleable and accommodating. By assuring potential buyers that she had been thoroughly prepared for her duties." Lady Ashworth's expression grew colder with each word. "I see. And you, Your Grace, have purchased Miss Hart?" "I have purchased her freedom," Adrian corrected. "She is no longer subject to Sir Reginald's authority or available for his schemes. She is free to make her own choices about her future." For the first time since the confrontation began, Vivienne found her voice. "Your Grace," she said softly, her words barely audible above the murmur of the crowd that had gathered to watch the proceedings. I don't understand. What do you expect from me in return?" The question hung in the air, and Adrian realized that she was asking what every person present was wondering. In a world where nothing was given freely, where every transaction had a price, what did he want from her? Adrian turned to face her fully, and for a moment the crowd, the whispers, the scandal of the situation faded away. There was something in her violet eyes, a combination of hope and fear, gratitude and suspicion, that reminded him of a wild animal that had been caged for so long it no longer believed in the possibility of freedom. "Nothing," he said simply. "I expect nothing from you, Miss Hart. You are free. Free to go where you choose, to live as you see fit, to make your own decisions about your life and your future. The only thing I ask is that you never again allow anyone to treat you as these men were treating you tonight." Vivian stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. But that's impossible. No one does something like this for nothing. There must be something you want." "There is," Adrian admitted, and he saw her tense as if preparing for the blow she had been expecting all along. "I want to see you smile. I want to see you walk out of here with your head held high, knowing that you are beholden to no one. I want to see you live the life you choose, not the one that has been chosen for you." The silence that followed was broken by a slow, deliberate clapping. Everyone turned to see the Dowager Countess of Whitmore, one of the most formidable women in London society, making her way through the crowd with a smile of genuine approval on her weathered face. "Bravo, Your Grace," she said as she reached the group. "It's been far too long since I've seen a gentleman behave like one in this cesspit of greed and ambition we call polite society." Her words carried the weight of absolute authority, and several of the men who had been part of the original auction began to edge away, clearly hoping to escape before their participation became common knowledge. "Lady Whitmore," Adrian said with a bow, "I'm honored by your approval." "You should be," the old woman replied tartly. "And you, young lady," she continued, turning to Vivian, "should accept His Grace's offer with gratitude and dignity. It's not often that true gallantry appears in our world." Vivian looked between the Dowager Countess and Adrian, her mind clearly struggling to process what had just happened. I don't know what to say." "Say thank you," Lady Whitmore advised. "Say goodbye to these vultures who would have devoured you, and say hello to the rest of your life." As the crowd began to disperse, and the immediate drama of the confrontation faded, Vivian felt as though she were emerging from a long, dark tunnel into the light. The air seemed cleaner, the future brighter, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt hope stirring in her chest. "Thank you," she said to Adrian, her voice stronger now, filled with genuine gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you for seeing me as more than a commodity. Thank you for giving me back my life." Adrian's expression softened as he looked at her, seeing not just the beautiful young woman who had been offered for sale, but the strength and dignity that had allowed her to endure such treatment without being broken by it. "Thank you," he replied quietly, "for being worth saving, for showing me that there is still goodness in this world worth fighting for." As they stood together in the aftermath of the confrontation that had changed both their lives forever, neither Adrian nor Vivian could have imagined where their story would lead, but they both knew that something fundamental had shifted in that moment when he had asked, "What is the price?" and then paid it without hesitation. The Duke who had purchased a young woman's freedom, and the woman who had been brave enough to accept it, had begun a journey together that would transform not only their own lives, but the very society that had allowed such cruelty to flourish in its glittering ballrooms. And as London society buzzed with gossip about the extraordinary events at Lady Ashworth's ball, Adrian Kingsley and Vivian Hart walked into an uncertain but hopeful future, forever linked by a single moment of courage that had changed everything. The morning after the pale light of dawn was filtering through the tall windows of Whitmore House, when Vivian Hart finally allowed herself to believe that the previous evening had not been an elaborate dream. She sat in the elegant morning room, still wearing the same dress she had worn to Lady Ashworth's ball, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Lady Whitmore had insisted on bringing her home after the dramatic confrontation, brooking no argument from either Vivian or the various gentlemen who had suddenly found themselves very interested in her welfare once the Duke of Kingsley had made his extraordinary gesture. The older woman had provided sanctuary without questions, understanding instinctively that Vivian needed time to process what had happened before she could even begin to think about what came next. "You haven't slept," Lady Whitmore observed as she entered the morning room, her sharp eyes taking in Vivian's pale complexion and the way she sat perfectly still, as if movement might shatter the fragile peace she had found. "I was afraid to," Vivian admitted softly. "Afraid that if I closed my eyes I would wake up back in Sir Reginald's house, and all of this would have been nothing more than a beautiful dream." Lady Whitmore settled herself in the chair across from Vivian, her expression gentle but practical. "My dear child, you are quite safe here. Sir Reginald has no claim on you now, and even if he did, he would not dare to cross the Duke of Kingsley. You are free, truly free, perhaps for the first time in your adult life. Free." The word still felt foreign on Vivian's tongue, like a language she had once known but had forgotten how to speak. For so long, her life had been dictated by others, first by her parents' death, then by Sir Reginald's increasingly desperate schemes. The idea that she could now choose her own path was both exhilarating and terrifying. "What am I supposed to do with freedom?" she asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her through the long night. "I have no money, no family except Sir Reginald, no skills beyond those of a gentleman's daughter. How does one build a life from nothing?" "One begins," Lady Whitmore said simply, "by deciding what kind of life one wants to build. You are young, intelligent, and now you have something more precious than money. You have choices. The question is, what do you choose?" Before Vivienne could answer, they were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Whitmore's butler, carrying a silver salver with the Morning Post. "A letter for Miss Hart, my lady," he announced, presenting the salver with formal dignity. Vivienne accepted the letter with surprise, noting the expensive paper and elegant handwriting. The seal bore the Kingsley coat of arms, and her heart began to race as she realized it was from Adrian. "From our gallant Duke, I presume," Lady Whitmore observed with barely concealed interest. Vivienne broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The message was brief but warm. "Miss Hart, I hope this letter finds you well rested and in good spirits after the events of last evening. I write not to intrude upon your privacy, but to ensure that you understand the practical implications of your new circumstances. You are now completely free from Sir Reginald's authority, but I realize that freedom without resources can be its own form of imprisonment. I have taken the liberty of establishing a modest trust in your name, sufficient to provide for your immediate needs, while you decide upon your future course. Additionally, I have a small property in the Cotswolds that has stood empty since my aunt's passing. If you would find it agreeable, you are welcome to make it your home for as long as you wish. The house is fully furnished and comes with a small staff who would be honored to serve you. Please understand that these arrangements come with no obligations or expectations. You are free to accept or decline as you see fit, and your decision will in no way affect my commitment to your welfare. I remain, as always, your devoted servant, Adrian Kingsley P.S. I have also taken the liberty of having my solicitors investigate Sir Reginald's handling of your inheritance. I believe you may be entitled to considerably more than he has led you to believe." Vivienne read the letter twice, her mind reeling with the implications of what Adrian was offering, not just freedom, but the means to maintain that freedom with dignity and independence. It was generosity beyond anything she had dared to hope for. "Well," Lady Whitmore prompted gently, "what does our Duke have to say?" Vivienne handed over the letter, watching as the older woman's eyebrows rose with each line she read. "Remarkable," Lady Whitmore murmured when she finished. "Truly remarkable. I have known Adrian Kingsley since he was a boy, and I have never seen him take such a personal interest in anyone's welfare. You have clearly made quite an impression on him." "But why?" Vivienne asked, the question that had been plaguing her since the previous evening. "Why would he do so much for someone he barely knows? What could he possibly gain from helping me?" Lady Whitmore studied Vivienne's face with the shrewd intelligence that had made her one of London's most formidable social arbiters. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "the question is not what he gains, but what he sees in you that others have missed. I don't understand." "Adrian Kingsley is one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in England," Lady Whitmore explained. "He could have any woman he chooses, yet he remains unmarried. He could buy any luxury, yet he lives simply. He could wield enormous influence, yet he stays largely apart from society. Do you know why?" Vivienne shook her head, genuinely curious about the man who had so dramatically altered her fate. "Because he has seen too much of what money and power can corrupt," Lady Whitmore continued. "He has watched marriages arranged for financial gain, friendships bought and sold, and human dignity sacrificed on the altar of social advancement. I believe that when he saw what was happening to you last night, he recognized something he had almost stopped believing in, genuine innocence and integrity in a world that values neither. You think he helped me because he saw something good in me. I think he helped you because you reminded him that goodness still exists," Lady Whitmore said gently, "and perhaps because helping you allowed him to strike a blow against the very system that has made him so cynical about human nature." Vivienne considered this, trying to reconcile the image of Adrian as a disillusioned idealist with the commanding figure who had faced down a room full of predators without flinching. "What should I do?" she asked finally. "About his offer, I mean. It seems too generous to accept, but you need security while you find your footing," Lady Whitmore finished. "My dear, there is no shame in accepting help when it is freely offered. The Duke has made it clear that he expects nothing in return, except that you use this opportunity to build a life that brings you happiness. Can you think of any reason to refuse such a gift?" Vivienne could think of several reasons: pride, fear of obligation, uncertainty about Adrian's true motives, but none of them seemed compelling enough to reject what might be her only chance at true independence. "I suppose I should write to thank him," she said, though the prospect of finding adequate words for such extraordinary generosity seemed daunting. "Indeed you should," Lady Whitmore agreed, "and you should also begin thinking about what kind of life you want to build with the freedom he has given you. What interests you? What brings you joy? What would you do if you could do anything at all?" The questions were ones Vivienne had never been allowed to consider. Under Sir Reginald's control, her life had been entirely dictated by his needs and schemes. The idea that she could now pursue her own interests, develop her own talents, and make her own choices was both thrilling and overwhelming. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been free to think about such things. I suppose I enjoyed reading, before Sir Reginald decided that too much education was dangerous for a woman, and I used to love painting watercolors, though I haven't touched a brush in years." "Then perhaps," Lady Whitmore suggested with a smile, "it's time to rediscover those passions." The Duke's property in the Cotswolds would provide the perfect setting for both pursuits: quiet, beautiful, and far from the prying eyes of London society. As the morning progressed, Vivienne found herself warming to the idea of accepting Adrian's offer. The prospect of a home of her own, however modest, filled her with a longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. To wake each morning knowing that the day was hers to spend as she chose, to read what she pleased, to paint if the mood struck her, to simply exist without constantly calculating how to avoid Sir Reginald's displeasure, it seemed like paradise. She spent the afternoon crafting her response to Adrian, writing and rewriting, until she had captured exactly the tone she wanted: grateful, but not groveling; accepting, but not presumptuous. "Your Grace, I am overwhelmed by your generosity and kindness. Your offer of sanctuary and support comes at a time when I had begun to despair of ever finding a path to independence, and I accept it with a gratitude that words cannot adequately express. I understand that you expect nothing in return for this extraordinary gift, but I hope you will allow me to promise that I will not waste the opportunity you have given me. I will use this chance to discover who I am when I am free to be myself, and I will strive to become someone worthy of your faith in me. If it is convenient, I would be honored to accept your offer of the Cotswolds property. The prospect of a quiet home, where I can begin to rebuild my life, fills me with more hope than I have felt in years. I remain, with deepest gratitude and respect, Vivienne Hart, P.S. Thank you also for investigating my inheritance. Whatever the outcome, I am grateful to finally learn the truth about my parents' legacy." She sealed the letter and gave it to Lady Whitmore's footman to deliver, then spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation, wondering what her new life would hold. The response came the next morning, along with a packet of legal documents and a letter of credit from Adrian's bank. "Miss Hart, your acceptance of my offer brings me more satisfaction than you can imagine. I have instructed my steward to prepare Rosewood Manor for your arrival, and you may travel there whenever you feel ready to begin your new life. The enclosed documents establish the trust I mentioned, providing you with an annual income of £500. It is not a fortune, but it should be sufficient to maintain a comfortable household and allow you the freedom to pursue your interests without financial worry. I have also included the preliminary report from my solicitors regarding your inheritance. I'm afraid the news is both good and bad. Your parents left you considerably more than Sir Reginald claimed, but much of it has been spent or misappropriated. We are exploring legal remedies, though I must warn you that recovery may be difficult. Please know that regardless of what we are able to recover from your original inheritance, the arrangements I have made for you are permanent and unconditional. You need never fear returning to the circumstances from which I was privileged to rescue you. I wish you every happiness in your new life, and I hope that Rosewood will provide the peace and security you deserve. Your devoted friend, Adrian Vivienne, stared at the documents with wonder and disbelief. £500 a year was indeed not a fortune, but it was more than enough for a single woman to live comfortably and independently. Combined with the house and staff Adrian had provided, it represented a level of security she had never dared to dream of. But it was the postscript about her inheritance that truly shocked her. Her parents had left her more than Sir Reginald had claimed. How much more? And what had he done with the money that should have been hers? The solicitor's report provided some answers, though they only served to deepen her anger at her guardian's betrayal. Her father had been a successful merchant with investments in several profitable ventures. Her mother had brought a substantial dowry to the marriage. Together, they had accumulated an estate worth nearly £15,000, a sum that should have made Vivienne quite independent and eliminated any need for her to marry for financial security. Sir Reginald had systematically looted the inheritance, using the money to cover his gambling debts and failed investments. By the time Vivienne came of age, little remained except the property itself, which he had mortgaged to the hilt. He had then convinced her that her parents had died nearly penniless, leaving her dependent on his charity and goodwill. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that Vivienne felt physically ill as she read the details. Not only had Sir Reginald stolen her inheritance, but he had also stolen years of her life by making her believe she had no choices, no options except those he provided. The villain, Lady Whitmore said grimly when Vivienne shared the report with her. To steal from an orphaned girl and then try to sell her to cover his crimes, it's unconscionable. Can anything be done? Vivienne asked, though she suspected the answer would not be encouraging. The Duke's solicitors will do what they can, Lady Whitmore replied. But I'm afraid that recovering money from a man like Sir Reginald is rather like squeezing water from a stone. Still, there may be some satisfaction in seeing him face the consequences of his actions. As it turned out, those consequences came sooner than anyone expected. 2 days later, the morning papers carried the news that Sir Reginald Blackwood had fled London in the dead of night, leaving behind a mountain of debts and several very angry creditors. Rumours suggested that he had taken passage on a ship bound for the Americas, though his exact destination remained unknown. Good riddance, Lady Whitmore declared when she read the news, though I'm sorry he escaped before he could be properly called to account for his crimes. Vivienne felt a complex mixture of emotions at the news of Sir Reginald's flight. There was relief that she would never have to see him again, anger that he had escaped justice, and a strange sort of emptiness at the realization that this chapter of her life was truly closed. I suppose it doesn't matter now, she said finally. He can't hurt me anymore, and that's what's important. Indeed, Lady Whitmore agreed. And now you can focus on the future, rather than dwelling on the past. When do you plan to travel to Rosewood? Vivienne had been thinking about that very question. Part of her wanted to leave immediately, to begin her new life as soon as possible, but another part of her was reluctant to leave the safety and comfort of Lady Whitmore's protection. Soon, she said finally. Perhaps next week. I want to be certain that all the arrangements are in place. A wise decision, Lady Whitmore approved. And remember, my dear, that Rosewood is not so far from London that you cannot visit whenever you choose. You will always have a home here if you need one. The kindness in the older woman's voice brought tears to Vivienne's eyes. In the space of a few days, she had gone from having no one who cared about her welfare to being surrounded by people who seemed genuinely invested in her happiness. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without your kindness. Nonsense, Lady Whitmore replied briskly, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. You would have found a way to survive, just as you survived everything else Sir Reginald put you through. You're stronger than you know, my dear. Now you'll have the chance to discover just how strong. As Vivienne prepared for her journey to Rosewood Manor and the beginning of her new life, she reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this point. A week ago, she had been a prisoner in all but name, facing a future that held nothing but degradation and despair. Now she was free, independent, and filled with hope for what lay ahead. It was all thanks to a man who had asked a simple question, "What is the price?" and then paid it without hesitation. Adrian Kingsley had not just purchased her freedom, he had given her the chance to discover who she truly was when she was free to be herself. As her carriage rolled through the English countryside toward her new home, Vivienne Hart looked toward the future with anticipation rather than dread for the first time in years. She was finally free to write her own story, and she intended to make it a good one. Rosewood, the Cotswolds in late spring, were a revelation of beauty that took Vivienne's breath away. As her carriage wound through rolling hills dotted with sheep and ancient stone walls, She felt something inside her chest loosen and expand, a sense of space and possibility she had never experienced before. The air was sweet with the scent of hawthorn and wild roses, and the countryside stretched away in every direction like a promise of freedom made manifest. When Rosewood Manor finally came into view, nestled in a valley between two gentle hills and surrounded by gardens that seemed to blend seamlessly into the natural landscape, Vivienne felt tears spring to her eyes. It was perfect, not grand or imposing like the great houses of London society, but warm and welcoming, built of honey-coloured Cotswold stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. "Welcome to Rosewood, Miss Hart," said Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had come out to greet her arrival. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with kind eyes and the sort of practical competence that immediately put Vivienne at ease. "I hope you'll be very happy here." "I'm sure I will be," Vivienne replied, and for the first time in years, she meant it completely. The interior of the house was as charming as its exterior. The rooms were furnished with comfortable pieces that invited relaxation rather than demanding admiration. Deep chairs perfect for reading, writing desks positioned to catch the best light, and everywhere the kind of personal touches that made a house feel like a home. Fresh flowers filled every room, and the windows had been thrown open to let in the sweet country air. "His Grace was very particular about the preparations," Mrs. Pemberton explained, as she led Vivienne through the main rooms. "He wanted everything to be perfect for your arrival. The library has been restocked with the latest novels and poetry, and the morning room has been arranged as a studio should you wish to pursue artistic endeavors." Vivienne paused in the doorway of the library, overwhelmed by the sight of shelves filled with books she had only dreamed of reading. There were novels by authors she had heard whispered about in London drawing rooms, but had never been allowed to read. Volumes of poetry that Sir Reginald had deemed unsuitable for young ladies, and treatises on subjects ranging from natural philosophy to political economy. "This is incredible," she murmured, running her fingers along the leather spines. "I had no idea he had gone to such trouble." "His Grace said you were a great reader," Mrs. Pemberton observed with a smile. "He was quite specific about including works that would challenge and inspire you. Said he thought you might enjoy having the freedom to read whatever interested you." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought fresh tears to Vivienne's eyes. Even in her absence, Adrian had been thinking about what would bring her joy and intellectual stimulation. It was a kindness so profound that she wasn't sure she would ever fully comprehend it. The morning room that had been converted into a studio was equally thoughtful. Easels stood ready with fresh canvases, and a table held an array of paints, brushes, and other artistic supplies that would have cost more than most people earned in a year. The room faced east to catch the morning light, and French doors opened onto a terrace that overlooked the rose garden. "I haven't painted in years," Vivienne said softly, touching one of the brushes with reverent fingers. "Then perhaps it's time to begin again," Mrs. Pemberton suggested gently. "His Grace said that you should feel free to pursue any interests that brought you pleasure. He was quite adamant that this should be a place where you could discover who you truly are." As the days passed, Vivienne began to settle into a routine that was entirely of her own choosing. She rose when she pleased, ate what she enjoyed, and spent her time exactly as she saw fit. It was a freedom so complete that it sometimes left her dizzy with possibility. She discovered that she loved gardening, spending hours working alongside the groundskeeper to tend the roses that had been the previous owner's pride and joy. She found that she had a natural talent for watercolor painting, capturing the changing light on the surrounding hills and the delicate beauty of the flowers that bloomed in profusion around the house, and she learned that she was, indeed, a voracious reader, devouring books on subjects she had never been allowed to explore. But perhaps most importantly, she discovered that she was capable of happiness, real uncomplicated joy in simple pleasures, the taste of strawberries from her own garden, the satisfaction of a well-executed painting, the peace of an evening spent reading by the fire. For the first time in her adult life, she was living rather than merely surviving. A month after her arrival at Rosewood, Vivienne received her first letter from Adrian. She had been wondering if he would write, hoping for some word from the man who had so dramatically changed her life, but also fearing that any communication might come with obligations or expectations she was not ready to meet. "Dear Miss Hart, I hope this letter finds you well settled at Rosewood and beginning to discover the pleasures of independence. Mrs. Pemberton writes that you have taken to country life with enthusiasm, which pleases me more than I can express. I confess that I have been thinking of you often since your departure from London. Not with concern for your welfare, I have complete confidence in your ability to thrive, but with curiosity about what you are discovering about yourself in your new circumstances. I find myself wondering what books you are reading, what subjects capture your interest, what dreams you are beginning to pursue now that you are free to dream. If you are amenable, I would very much like to hear from you. Not formal reports on the property or dutiful expressions of gratitude, but genuine communication between two people who have shared an extraordinary experience. I would value your thoughts on any subject you care to discuss, from the most trivial observations about country life to the most profound reflections on freedom and happiness. I hope you will not think it presumptuous of me to say that our brief acquaintance has had a profound effect on my own thinking. Watching you maintain your dignity and grace in the face of such degrading treatment reminded me that courage and integrity still exist in this world, even when they seem to be in short supply. I remain, with the deepest respect and warmest regards, your friend, if I may presume to call myself such, Adrian. The letter was so different from what Vivienne had expected that she read it 3 times before its meaning fully sank in. Adrian wasn't writing as a benefactor checking on his charity case. He was writing as a friend, expressing genuine interest in her thoughts and experiences. More than that, he was suggesting that their encounter had affected him as much as it had her. She spent 2 days crafting her response, writing and rewriting until she had captured exactly the tone she wanted. Warm, but not presumptuous. Grateful but not obsequious, honest but not overly revealing. Dear Adrian, if I may return the presumption, your letter brought me more joy than you can imagine, not only because it was so thoughtfully written, but because it confirmed something I had hoped but hardly dared believe, that our connection transcends the circumstances of our meeting. You ask what I am discovering about myself, and the answer is both simple and profound. I am discovering that I am capable of contentment, which is something I had begun to doubt during the dark years under Sir Reginald's control. I wake each morning with anticipation rather than dread, and I sleep each night with satisfaction rather than anxiety. These may seem like small things, but to someone who has lived as I lived, they are nothing short of miraculous. I am also discovering talents and interests I never knew I possessed. Did you know that different varieties of roses require completely different care? Or that the light in the Cotswolds changes quality throughout the day in ways that make each hour perfect for different artistic pursuits? These are the kinds of revelations that fill my days now, and I find them endlessly fascinating. But perhaps most importantly, I'm discovering that I have opinions, preferences, and desires that are entirely my own. For so long, I defined myself in opposition to what others wanted from me that I lost sight of what I wanted for myself. Now, in the blessed silence of Rosewood, I am finally beginning to hear my own voice. You mentioned that our encounter affected your own thinking. I confess myself curious about how, though I understand if you prefer not to elaborate, I find it difficult to believe that someone of your position and experience could be influenced by someone like me. Thank you for asking about my welfare, and thank you for caring about the answer. Your friendship is a gift I treasure more than I can express. With warmest regards and deepest gratitude, Vivienne. The correspondence that followed became the highlight of Vivienne's weeks. Adrian's letters arrived with clockwork regularity, filled with observations about London society, reflections on books he was reading, and thoughtful questions about her own experiences and opinions. In return, Vivienne found herself writing with increasing freedom and honesty, sharing not just the pleasant details of her new life, but also her struggles, doubts, and growing sense of self-discovery. Through their letters, she began to see a different side of Adrian than the commanding figure who had rescued her from Sir Reginald's auction. This Adrian was thoughtful, sometimes melancholy, deeply intelligent and surprisingly vulnerable. He wrote about his isolation, his difficulty trusting others' motives, and his growing conviction that genuine connection was possible but rare. I find myself envying your solitude, he wrote in one particularly revealing letter. You have chosen to withdraw from society in order to discover yourself, while I remain trapped in it, playing a role that grows more tiresome with each passing day. Sometimes I think the greatest freedom would be to simply disappear from London entirely and find some quiet place where I could be myself rather than the Duke of Kingsley. Do you think it's possible for someone like me to change? To step away from the expectations and obligations that have defined my entire life? Or am I too set in my ways, too bound by duty and tradition to ever truly break free? Vivienne's response was immediate and heartfelt. Of course it's possible to change. You proved that the night you rescued me. You stepped outside the role society expected you to play and acted according to your own conscience and compassion. If you could do it once, you can do it again. The question is not whether you can change, but whether you want to badly enough to accept the cost that change would require. Freedom always comes with a price, as we both know. The question is whether what you gain is worth what you must give up. As for disappearing from London, I can tell you from experience that solitude is both a blessing and a challenge. It allows you to discover who you truly are, but it also forces you to confront aspects of yourself that you might prefer to avoid. Are you prepared for that kind of honesty with yourself? Their correspondence continued through the summer and into the autumn, growing deeper and more intimate with each exchange. Vivian found herself looking forward to Adrian's letters with an anticipation that went far beyond mere friendship, though she was careful not to read more into his words than was actually there. It was in October, as the leaves were turning gold and crimson around Rosewood, that everything changed. Vivian was in her studio, working on a watercolor of the rose garden in its autumn glory, when Mrs. Pemberton knocked on the door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Hart," she said, "you have a visitor. His Grace the Duke of Kingsley has arrived and requests an audience." Vivian's brush clattered to the floor, sending droplets of paint across the canvas she had been working on. "Adrian is here, now?" "Indeed, miss. He's waiting in the drawing room. Shall I tell him you'll receive him?" Vivian's mind raced as she tried to process this unexpected development. In all their months of correspondence, Adrian had never mentioned visiting Rosewood. What could have brought him here so suddenly, and why did the prospect of seeing him again make her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with surprise? "Yes," she said, attempting to compose herself while frantically trying to remove paint stains from her fingers. "Tell him I'll be down directly." "Perhaps you'd like to change your dress, miss," Mrs. Pemberton suggested diplomatically, taking in Vivian's paint-stained apron and disheveled appearance. "Yes, of course," Vivian replied, grateful for the housekeeper's tact. "Give me 10 minutes." She flew up the stairs to her chamber, her mind whirling with questions and possibilities. What had brought Adrian to Rosewood? Was something wrong? Had there been developments regarding Sir Reginald or her stolen inheritance? Or was this simply a friendly visit from a man who had grown tired of conducting their friendship through letters? As she changed into her best day dress, a simple but elegant gown of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, Vivian caught sight of herself in the mirror and was startled by what she saw. The pale, frightened young woman who had arrived at Rosewood 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who glowed with health and happiness. Her cheeks had filled out, her eyes sparkled with vitality, and there was a confidence in her bearing that spoke of someone who had finally learned to value herself. When she entered the drawing room, Adrian was standing with his back to the door, gazing out at the garden where the last roses of the season bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. He turned as she entered, and Vivian felt her breath catch at the sight of him. He was even more handsome than she remembered, tall and broad-shouldered, with those striking green eyes and auburn hair that caught the light filtering through the windows. But there was something different about him too. The rigid control that had characterized his demeanor in London had softened, and there was a warmth in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. "Vivian," he said, her name falling from his lips like a caress. "You look radiant." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy in his presence despite their months of intimate correspondence. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" Adrian's smile was rueful. "Everything is perfectly all right. I'm afraid I came on impulse, something I'm not usually given to. I was passing through the area on estate business and found myself unable to resist the opportunity to see how you were faring." "I'm faring very well, as you can see," Vivian said, gesturing around the comfortable room. "Thanks entirely to your generosity." "Not my generosity," Adrian corrected gently. "Your own strength and resilience. I merely provided the opportunity. You've done all the real work of building a new life." They stood looking at each other for a moment, the air between them charged with an awareness that neither had acknowledged in their letters, but that was impossible to ignore in person. "Would you like some tea?" Vivian asked finally, needing something to do with her hands. "Or perhaps you'd like to see the garden. The roses are nearly finished for the season, but they're still quite beautiful." "I'd like that very much," Adrian replied, and something in his tone suggested that he was talking about more than just the roses. As they walked through the garden together, Vivian found herself acutely aware of Adrian's presence beside her, the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way he listened to her observations about the plants and flowers with genuine interest, the way his eyes seemed to follow her every movement with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You've transformed this place, Adrian observed, as they paused beside a trellis heavy with the last climbing roses of the season. Mrs. Pemberton writes that you've been working in the garden yourself, but I had no idea you had such a talent for it. I never knew I had any talent for it either, Vivienne admitted, reaching out to touch one of the velvety petals. It's amazing what you discover about yourself when you're finally free to explore your interests. And what else have you discovered? Adrian asked, his voice carrying a note of something deeper than casual curiosity. Vivienne looked at him, noting the way the afternoon light caught the copper highlights in his hair, and the way his green eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. I've discovered that I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient, more capable of happiness than I ever imagined possible. And what makes you happy? Adrian asked softly, stepping closer to her. Simple things, Vivienne replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The satisfaction of watching something grow under my care, the pleasure of reading a book that challenges my thinking, the joy of painting something beautiful, the anticipation of receiving a letter from a friend who understands me. Is that what I am to you? Adrian asked, his eyes searching her face. A friend? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them had dared to voice in their careful correspondence. Vivienne felt her heart racing as she realized that they had reached a moment of truth, a point where pretense would no longer suffice. I don't know, she said honestly. I know that your letters have become the most important part of my week. I know that I find myself thinking about you at odd moments throughout the day. I know that seeing you again has made me realize how much I've missed your physical presence, not just your words on a page. Adrian's breath caught at her honesty. Vivienne, but I also know, she continued, her voice growing stronger, that I am not the same woman you rescued 6 months ago. I am no longer desperate or grateful enough to mistake dependency for deeper feeling. If what I feel for you is real, it's because of who you are, not because of what you've done for me. Adrian reached out and took her hands in his touch sending electricity through her entire being. And what do you feel for me? Vivienne looked into his eyes and saw her own emotions reflected there, longing, uncertainty, hope, and something deeper that neither of them had yet dared to name. I feel, she began, then stopped, struggling to find words for emotions she had never been allowed to explore. I feel as though I've been waiting my entire life to meet someone who sees me as you do, someone who values my thoughts, respects my independence, and cares about my happiness without trying to control it. Vivienne, Adrian said, his voice rough with emotion, I came here today because I couldn't stay away any longer. These months of correspondence have shown me something I never expected to find. A woman of intelligence, courage, and integrity, who challenges me to be a better man. I've fallen in love with your mind, your spirit, your strength. I've fallen in love with you. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Vivienne felt her world shift on its axis once again. But this time, the change brought not fear, but a joy so profound it took her breath away. I love you too, she whispered, the words she had been afraid to even think finally finding their voice. I think I've loved you since that first night when you asked what is the price, and then paid it without hesitation, but I was afraid to believe it was real, afraid that gratitude was masquerading as something deeper. And now? Adrian asked, stepping closer until there was barely an inch of space between them. Now I know the difference, Vivienne replied, reaching up to touch his face with trembling fingers. Gratitude is what I feel for your generosity. Love is what I feel for the man who writes to me about books and philosophy, who worries about my happiness, who sees me as an equal rather than a possession. The kiss that followed was everything their careful correspondence had promised, and more tender and passionate, desperate and gentle, a perfect fusion of two hearts that had found their home in each other. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and laughing through their tears. Marry me, Adrian said, his forehead resting against hers. Not because you owe me anything, not because it's practical or expected, but because you love me and I love you, and we deserve the happiness we can create together. Yes, Vivienne replied without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you, but I have one condition. Adrian raised an eyebrow, his expression amused despite the intensity of the moment. You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Miss Hart. I'm a duke, remember? And I'm a woman who has learned the value of her own worth, Vivienne replied with a smile that was both loving and determined. My condition is this. We marry as equals, not duke and rescued maiden, not benefactor and grateful recipient, but as two people who choose each other freely and completely. Agreed, Adrian said, sealing the bargain with another kiss. Though I should warn you that marrying a duke comes with certain social obligations. And I should warn you that marrying me comes with a wife who has opinions, ambitions, and absolutely no intention of being a decorative duchess who smiles and says nothing. Thank God, Adrian laughed. I was hoping for exactly that kind of wife. 3 years later, the grand ballroom of Kingsley House blazed with light and laughter as London's most progressive members of society gathered for the 3rd annual charity auction benefiting the Vivian Kingsley Foundation for Vulnerable Women. The foundation, established shortly after the Duke and Duchess's marriage, had already helped hundreds of young women escape situations similar to the one that had nearly destroyed the Duchess herself. Vivian stood at the front of the room, radiant in a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the color of her eyes, addressing the assembled crowd with the confidence and authority that had made her one of London's most respected social reformers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her clear voice carrying easily through the ballroom, "tonight we celebrate not just the success of our foundation, but the fundamental principle that every human being deserves the right to choose their own destiny. 3 years ago, many of you witnessed a transaction that changed my life forever. Tonight, I ask you to participate in transactions that will change the lives of countless others." The applause was thunderous, and Adrian felt his heart swell with pride as he watched his wife command the room with the same grace and courage she had shown on their first meeting. The frightened young woman who had been offered for sale had become a force for change that was transforming society's treatment of its most vulnerable members. "The first item for auction tonight," Vivian continued, "is something very close to my heart. A first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, donated by His Grace the Duke of Kingsley, who believes, as I do, that education and independence are the greatest gifts we can offer to any woman." The bidding was spirited, with the book ultimately selling for an amount that would fund the foundation's work for months. But Adrian knew that the real victory wasn't in the money raised, it was in the conversations that were happening throughout the ballroom, the minds that were being changed, the commitment to reform that was growing stronger with each passing year. As the evening wound down and the last of their guests departed, Adrian found Vivian in the garden, standing beneath the same stars that had witnessed their first conversation about love and choice at Rosewood. "Tired?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pulling her back against his chest. "Exhilarated," Vivian replied, leaning into his warmth. "Did you see Lady Pemberton's face when young Miss Crawford refused her son's proposal in front of half the ton? I think we're finally making real progress in changing how society views women's autonomy." "We are," Adrian agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I think the credit belongs primarily to a certain duchess who has never been afraid to speak truth to power." "The credit belongs to a certain duke who asked the right question at the right moment," Vivian corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "What is the price? You changed everything with those 4 words." "We changed everything," Adrian said firmly. "Together." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of their butler, who carried a letter bearing urgent seals. "Your Graces," he said with a bow, "this just arrived by special messenger. The gentleman said it was of the utmost importance." Adrian accepted the letter, noting the official government seals with some surprise. As he read, his expression grew increasingly amazed. "What is it?" Vivian asked, noting his reaction. "An invitation," Adrian said slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. "From the Prime Minister himself. It seems our work with the Foundation has attracted attention at the highest levels of government. They're proposing new legislation to protect vulnerable women and children, and they want us to serve as advisors to the committee drafting the reforms." Vivian felt her breath catch. "They want to make our work part of the law." "It appears so," Adrian replied, his voice filled with wonder. "The letter mentions specifically that your personal experience and our Foundation's practical work have provided valuable insights into the gaps in current legal protections." "This could change everything," Vivian whispered, the magnitude of the opportunity beginning to sink in, not just for individual women, but for society as a whole. "It could indeed," Adrian agreed. "The question is, are you prepared for that level of public scrutiny? Serving as a government advisor would mean that our story, our Foundation's work, everything we've built together, would be subject to intense public examination." Vivian considered this, thinking of all the women who were still trapped in situations like the one she had escaped. The thought of being able to help them, not just individually, but through systemic change, was both thrilling and daunting. "I'm prepared," she said finally, her voice strong with conviction. "If sharing our story can help change laws that protect other women, Then I'm willing to face whatever scrutiny comes with it. Adrian's smile was filled with love and admiration. I had hoped you would say that, though I should warn you that this will likely mean spending considerable time in London, away from the peace of Rosewood. Rosewood will always be our sanctuary, Vivian replied, reaching up to touch his face. But our real home is wherever we're together, working towards something that matters. As they stood in their garden, surrounded by the beauty they had created together and the love they had chosen over convention, both Adrian and Vivian knew that their story was entering a new chapter. There would be new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, new ways to prove that love and justice could triumph over greed and exploitation. Do you ever regret it? Adrian asked, the question that had become something of a ritual between them. Accepting my offer that night? Taking such an enormous risk with a stranger? Vivian looked up at the stars, thinking of the frightened young woman who had stood in Lady Ashworth's ballroom 3 years ago, facing a future that held nothing but degradation and despair. Then she looked at her husband, the man who had seen her worth when no one else would, who had loved her enough to set her free, and who continued to support her dreams and ambitions with unwavering devotion. Never, she said with absolute conviction. It was the best decision I ever made, even though I had no way of knowing it at the time. It brought me you, brought me purpose, brought me a life of meaning that I never could have imagined. Even knowing what we know now about the challenges ahead, the public scrutiny, the political battles, the ongoing fight for reform, especially knowing all of that, Vivian replied firmly. Real love isn't about avoiding difficulties, Adrian. It's about facing them together, supporting each other through challenges, growing stronger rather than weaker in the face of adversity. We've done that, and we'll continue to do it for the rest of our lives. As they made their way back toward the house, hand in hand, Vivian reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. The Duke who had asked, "What is the price?" and the woman whose freedom he had purchased had discovered that the most valuable things in life, love, dignity, purpose, and hope, could never be bought or sold. They could only be freely given and gratefully received, nurtured with care, and shared with others who needed to know that change was possible, that justice could prevail, and that sometimes a single act of courage could transform not just individual lives but the world itself. The price of freedom, they had learned, was not measured in gold or property or social position. It was measured in the willingness to see others as fully human, to act with compassion even when it was costly, and to believe that love could indeed conquer all, not in the fairy tale sense of making all problems disappear, but in the real sense of giving people the strength and motivation to work together towards something greater than themselves. And that price, they both knew, was worth paying again and again, for as long as there were people who needed to be reminded that they were valuable, that they deserved better, and that someone, somewhere, was willing to ask the most important question of all: what is the price of human dignity? The answer, as Adrian and Vivian had discovered, was everything, and nothing at all. This tale reminds us that love often finds us in the most unexpected circumstances, and that true nobility lies not in birth or wealth, but in the courage to act according to one's conscience. Adrian and Vivian's story shows us that the most meaningful relationships are built on mutual respect, shared values, and the willingness to see each other as equals, regardless of the circumstances of their meeting. Their journey from a dramatic rescue to lasting love, and from personal happiness to public service, proves that the most beautiful love stories are those that inspire others to believe in the possibility of transformation, justice, and hope. In a world where people are too often treated as commodities, their foundation stands as a testament to the radical idea that every human being deserves the right to choose their own destiny. The Duke who asked, "What is the price?" and the woman who was brave enough to accept his offer of freedom created more than just their own happiness. They created a legacy that would continue to change lives long after their own story had ended.